My hands still shake when the weather turns. It isn't the cold, though the doctors tell me it is just the arthritis, the natural decay of a body that has outlasted its warranty. I know better. It is the memory of the vibration, the tremor of the earth along the Svir river that never really stopped. I can sit here in my warm kitchen, smelling the tea and the heavy rye bread, but if I close my eyes, the smell changes. It becomes wet wool, unwashed bodies, and the copper tang of fear. It becomes the smell of pine sap mixed with the sulfur of things burning that should not burn. I am an old man now, and sometimes I wonder if the things I remember are the things that happened, or just the stories I have polished over the decades like a river stone, until the rough edges are gone and only the weight remains. But I remember the mud. That I am certain of. It was a living thing in Karelia in 1943. A greedy, sucking mouth that wanted to swallow us whole before the bullets even had a chance. I was a hunter before I was a medic. I suppose I was a hunter while I was a medic, too, only the prey had changed, and the stakes were no longer about filling a larder. In the forests near Petrozavodsk, before the world went mad, silence was a tool. You wrapped it around yourself like a second skin. You moved through the taiga and you became the wind, stepping where the moss was thickest, breathing in rhythm with the rustle of the birch leaves. When you tracked an elk, there was a sacred logic to it. You understood the animal. You knew that if the wind blew from the north, the beast would shelter in the lie of the ridge. It was a conversation between you and the forest. But in the trench, silence was a lie. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down on your chest, promising nothing but violence. I sat in the muck, my knees pulled to my chest to keep some warmth in my core, though the damp had long ago soaked through my trousers. I was cleaning my kit. It was a nervous habit, a ritual to keep my hands from trembling. I wiped the shears, the scalpel, the glass syrettes of morphine. I treated them with the same reverence I used to show my rifle, but they felt wrong in my hands. A rifle is honest. It sends death away from you. These tools, these were for when death had already arrived, for when the metal had already torn through the meat. I looked at the boy next to me. I cannot remember his name. I want to call him Sasha, but I think I called every young soldier Sasha eventually. He was smoking a cigarette rolled with newspaper and tobacco that smelled like burning compost. He was staring at the tree line across the river, his eyes wide, unblinking. He was trying to see the enemy, but the enemy was the forest itself now. That was the hardest part for me to reconcile. The trees, the scrub brush, the dark, acidic water of the swamps. This was my church. This was where I had learned to walk, to track, to live. Now the Finns were out there, invisible, turning my sanctuary into a slaughterhouse. I felt a deep, twisting nausea, a sense of betrayal. The woods were supposed to protect the silent walker, not hide the monsters who rained fire from the sky. I remember looking at the canopy, the way the gray sky filtered through the pine needles. In the old life, a sky like that meant snow was coming, good for tracking. Now it just meant the artillery spotters would have trouble seeing us, which was a small mercy. But the fear was not about the shells. Not really. It was the immobility. A hunter moves. A trapper checks his lines. Here we were the ones caught in the trap, steel jaws clamped around our legs, waiting for the trapper to come and finish us off. I hated the waiting. I hated the feeling of being rooted to the mud, unable to run, unable to flank. I was a creature of movement, and this war was a cage. I tried to retreat into my mind, to walk the old trails. I closed my eyes and pictured the ridge north of my father's cabin. I imagined the crunch of frost under my boots, the smell of wood smoke, the weight of a hair swinging from my belt. I tried to summon the quiet confidence of the predator, the one who dictates the terms of the engagement. But the illusion was brittle. The mud in the trench was too cold. The smell of the latrine trench down the line too sharp. The vibration in the ground was constant, a low, thrumming anxiety that traveled up through the soles of my boots and settled in my teeth. Then the silence broke. It wasn't a roar. Not at first. It was a single dry snap, like a dead branch breaking under a heavy boot, but sharper, faster. The air above the trench hissed. The boy next to me, Sasha, let's call him Sasha, didn't move. He just stopped smoking, The cigarette fell from his lips, tumbling into the slurry at our feet. A dark hole had appeared in the center of his forehead, impossibly neat, a third eye opening to gaze at the hell we were living in. He slumped forward against the earthwork, looking for all the world like he had simply fallen asleep on watch. Then the scream came. It wasn't him. He was gone. It was from further down the line, a jagged, tearing sound that didn't sound human. Medic Volkov, get over here, the shout shattered my paralysis. The eyes of the men in the section turned to me. They were white-rimmed, desperate, pleading. They weren't looking at Dmitri, the hunter. They were looking at the man with the bag, the man who held the fragile threads of their lives in his dirty hands. The call had come, and it didn't care about my fear. It didn't care that I wanted to be back in the silent woods. The forest was screaming, and I had to go into it. I grabbed my bag, the leather strap biting into my shoulder. The transition from the passive waiting to the active nightmare was instantaneous. I didn't climb out of the trench. I scrambled, clawing at the wet earth, my fingernails tearing against roots and stones. I wasn't a soldier storming a position. I was a man trying to run through molasses while the world tried to dismantle him. The moment my head cleared the parapet, the universe changed. In the trench, the war was a rumor, a tension. Above the lip, it was a physical force. The air was no longer empty space. It was solid with noise. It wasn't just the sniper now. The finish line, hidden in that treacherous tree line, erupted. It sounded like 1,000 heavy chains being dragged across a corrugated iron roof, a relentless, grinding mechanical clatter. I stayed low, moving on my elbows and knees. This was where the hunter's instinct kicked in, but it was warped. Usually you move to stay quiet. Now I moved to stay small. I read the terrain not for spoor, but for cover. A slight depression in the mud, a crater rim, the stump of a blasted birch. These were my stepping stones. The air around me was alive. I could feel the passage of bullets, little angry hornets that snapped the air as they passed. They kicked up geysers of dirt into my eyes, filling my mouth with the grit of the motherland. I reached the voice. It was a sergeant, a big man from the Urals whose name I knew was Ivan. He was lying on his back in a shell hole, his hands clutching his thigh. The snow camouflage of his trousers was soaked in a dark, spreading stain that looked black under the gray sky. "Dmitri," he gasped, his teeth gritted so hard I thought they would crack. "Fix it, just fix it." I looked at the wound. It was ugly, a jagged piece of shrapnel, probably from a mortar that had landed short, had torn through the muscle. This wasn't the clean puncture of a bullet or the slice of a skinning knife. This was meat ground up by indifference. The sight of it made my stomach roll. But my hands took over. They moved with a speed that surprised me, detached from my terrified mind. I cut the fabric. I packed the wound. I applied the pressure. The blood was hot and slick, coating my fingers, making it hard to grip the bandage. "Hold still," I hissed, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. Lost in the cacophony, I worked with a frantic precision. I was sewing a tapestry in the middle of a hurricane. I managed to stop the bleeding, to bind the leg tight. For a second, just a second, I felt a surge of triumph. I had cheated the trap. I had used my hands to pull a man back from the edge. I looked up at Ivan, ready to tell him he would make it, that he would see the Urals again. The air pressure dropped. That's the only way I can describe it. A vacuum formed above us, sucking the breath from my lungs. Then the world turned white. The shockwave lifted me and threw me backward. I hit the mud hard, the wind knocked out of me, my ears ringing with a high, piercing whine that drowned out the battle. I shook my head, trying to clear the static, tasting copper and bile. I crawled back to the shell hole. Ivan was gone. The mortar hadn't landed in the hole, but close enough. The earth where he had been lying was churned up, smoking. His torso was there, but it was ruined, a puppet with its strings cut. The bandage I had applied so perfectly, with such hope, was just a white rag in the dirt, stained and useless. I stared at it. The absurdity of it choked me. The hunter's logic, effort equals result, skill equals success, was a lie here. You could be the best tracker, the best shot, the best healer. and the sky would still fall on you. It was random. It was industrial. It was a factory that produced corpses, and I was just a man with a sewing kit trying to fix the machinery while it was running. I didn't have time to mourn. I didn't have time to think. The volume of fire intensified, a crescendo that vibrated in the marrow of my bones. The ground began to shake rhythmically. Tanks, artillery barrage, it didn't matter. The order came down the line, passed from screaming mouth to screaming mouth, barely audible over the retreat, fall back to the second line. Fall back, panic is a contagious disease. I saw men breaking cover, running upright, abandoning the discipline of the earth. They were cut down like wheat. I knew I had to move. I grabbed my bag, heavy with the weight of my failure. I turned to crawl back toward the trench, toward safety. But the world was dissolving. A fresh barrage hammered the ground between me and my unit. The earth erupted in fountains of soil and fire. I was cut off. I looked toward the woods, the deep, dark woods that I knew better than any man here. To go back was death. To stay was death. But the forest was a hazard I understood. I made a choice. Or perhaps the choice was made for me by the lizard brain that wanted to survive. I turned my back on the trench, on the shouting, on the structured chaos of the army, and I scrambled into the smoke toward the trees, toward the unknown. I was alone now. The pack was separated, and the winter night was falling fast. The trees swallowed me. The roar of the artillery faded into a dull thrumming, like a headache behind the eyes. I was in the gray zone now. The taiga, my church, my office, my home. But it didn't feel like home. It felt like a cage. I moved with the instinct of the predator I used to be. Quiet steps, weight on the outside of the foot, rolling forward. Don't break the twig. Don't brush the fern. The snow was thin here, under the canopy mixed with black mud. I smelled them before I saw them. Iron and excrement. They were huddled in the lee of a fallen pine, half buried in needle drift. 2 hours, left behind in the panic. I knew the logic. I knew the protocol. In a rout, the wounded are anchors. You cut the line to save the ship. I approached. One was Sasha, a boy from the Urals. Gut shot. His hands were clamped over his stomach, trying to hold his life inside. The other was a sergeant I didn't know well. Legs shattered, bone white and jagged through the fabric. My brain, the hunter's brain, did the math instantly. 2 men, 300 pounds of dead weight. 5 miles of swamp and enemy patrols between us and the river. Probability of survival, 0. The smart thing was to keep moving. To survive, to fight another day. The wolf does not carry the wounded wolf. The wolf runs. But I stopped. I looked at Sasha's eyes. They were wide, glassy, reflecting the treetops. He wasn't a wolf. He was a boy who wrote letters to his mother on birch bark. I dropped my pack. I worked with a frenzy that wasn't panic, but something colder. I didn't have medical supplies. Not really. So I used the land. I stripped a birch sapling, my knife flashing in the gloom. The bark became a rigid sleeve for the sergeant's leg. I tore up my undershirt, packing the fabric with sphagnum moss, the old trapper's trick. It drinks blood better than cotton. It kills the rot. Then the transport. I couldn't carry them. I had to drag them. I cut 2 stout poles. I used our belts, their rifle slings. Every strip of leather we had. I lashed a crude travois together. A sled for meat. That's what we used to call it when we hauled a moose out of the deep woods. Now I was hauling men. I harnessed myself into the leather loops. I leaned forward. I pulled. The weight was impossible. It dug into my chest, compressing my lungs. My boots slipped in the freezing slush. I took a step, then another. The friction was a physical enemy, a hand grabbing me, holding me back. My worst fear was realizing itself. I was tethered. I was slow. I was prey. We moved like a wounded snake through the undergrowth. An hour passed, maybe 2. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Then, the snap of a branch. Not mine. I froze. I went to one knee, the leather straps biting into my shoulders. Voices, guttural, German, maybe 50 meters to the east. A patrol sweeping the woods. Sasha groaned. It was a low, bubbling sound. I clamped my hand over his mouth, my fingers sticky with his blood. His eyes fluttered open. He saw me. He saw the sweat freezing on my face. He heard the voices. He reached up, his hand weak, trembling, and gripped my wrist. He pulled my hand away from his mouth. Dmitri, he wheezed. Leave us. The Germans were closer. I could hear the crunch of their boots. Cut the straps. Sasha whispered. Run. I looked at the darkness of the trees ahead. Freedom, life. I looked back at the sled. The burden, the trap. I closed my eyes. The equation was simple. 1 lives, or 3 die. The hunter knows when to cut the line. I didn't cut the line. I leaned into the harness until the leather creaked. I didn't run. I didn't hide. I became the earth. I moved us into a depression, a hollow beneath the roots of a massive upturned spruce, and I covered us with the deadfall. We lay there for an eternity. The boots walked past us, so close I could have untied their laces. I held my breath until my lungs burned. I held Sasha's hand until his pulse slowed. When the silence returned, we moved. The return was a blur of agony. I ceased to be a man. I became an engine of leverage and friction. Night turned to gray morning, then back to night. I didn't navigate by map. I navigated by the tilt of the land, the flow of the groundwater. The Svir River calls to the water in the soil, and I followed the call. I fed them snow. I changed the moss dressings. I whispered lies to them about warm soup and clean sheets. My mind began to fracture. I wasn't in the war anymore. I was back on the trap line, but the harvest was wrong. The weight behind me wasn't furs to be sold. It was debt, heavy, breathing debt. I don't remember the moment we crossed the line. I remember a shout, a rifle bolt clicking. I remember raising my hands, but the straps wouldn't let me lift them high enough. Don't shoot, I croaked. My voice sounded like grinding stones. I have the catch. I brought them in. Friendly hands grabbed me. They cut the straps. The sudden weightlessness was terrifying. I felt like I would float away, up into the gray sky. I fell face first into the mud, and I slept. Years have passed. The war is a scar on the land that the moss has mostly covered. I am an old man now. I walk these woods again, near Petrozavodsk. The birch trees are tall and white, innocent of what they witnessed. People call me a hero. They say I saved 2 lives that day, but they don't understand the trade. I was a hunter. My life was defined by the clean separation of predator and prey. I set the trap. I took the prize. I walked away light. But on that retreat, I broke the fundamental law of the wild. I let the prey catch me. I still track. I still walk the trails. But I cannot look at a snare without flinching. I cannot look at a heavy pack without feeling the straps cutting into my soul. The machine of my profession is broken. The harvest is ruined because I know now that nothing in these woods is truly wild. Everything is connected by a thread of suffering. The silence of the forest used to be my peace. Now, it is just the pause between screams. I carry a claustrophobia in the open air. I am always waiting for the weight to return, for the straps to tighten. The true wilderness is not the forest or the swamp. It is the chaos that tempts us to abandon each other. Survival is not the goal. Our humanity is. The heaviest things we carry are not the wounded, but the souls we chose to leave behind. He learned on the Svir River that the only way to save yourself is to carry the weight of another. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.